So just wanted to welcome you all to today's session. So as you hopefully know, unless you came to the wrong Zoom link, this is the training session that we're running on policy impact and community engagement. And this is part of our Highlands and Islands Climate Change Community Researcher Network that I'm sure quite a lot of you know about already. And as part of this programme, we've been running two series of community grants to work with researchers. One, a New Voices grant, working on a climate change issue that matters to them, and also a capacity building grant. So thinking a bit more about the kind of structural needs and the kind of barriers or opportunities to enable community-led research in the long term. So as part of this programme, we have been creating and curating a specific tailored training programme to try and respond to some of the needs that have come out of this programme already. And thinking about policy, the impact of community-led research, or of the work people are doing within communities, and also the kind of sensitivities around community engagement was one of the biggest kind of strands that came out of a lot of the conversations that we had throughout the last few months. And so we're really delighted to have Catherine Rose, Stocks-Rankin, and Dave Blackbell, both from the Scottish Policy Research Exchange, to be delivering this training session today. So yeah, really, really pleased that you could all come. So just a very quick, brief overview. This is our where all our projects are across the Highlands and Islands, but I'm sure many of you know about the programme already. And just a little heads up about some of the other training programme sessions that we have. So next week we have one on measuring environmental impact, and looking at both kind of practical examples of how communities can be involved in decarbonisation methods and thinking about carbon audits, but also thinking, kind of zooming out and thinking about the kind of systemic environment, and how we can make sense of things like net zero, but also the role that communities can play in an ever-changing landscape, and an ever-changing policy landscape. So in many ways, a really nice kind of follow-on from today's session as well. And then a kind of theme that's been running right throughout our programme, especially thinking about capacity building. We will have a very specific training session on burnout prevention and recovery for climate activists, but again, not just within the climate context, obviously within third sector, community development, and yeah, just in general life at the moment. I think burnout is a very key issue for many people. So yeah, we're really pleased to be having that one as well. And we do hope to have another one on fundraising in the near future. So yeah, I will stop sharing for now. And yeah, I guess without further ado, I'm really, really pleased to hand over and to welcome Catherine Rose and Dave, who I'm sure will be able to do a better job of introducing themselves than I would. So yeah, I'll hand over to you guys. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, it's really nice to be here. We're actually really excited for the session. We normally don't get to engage with community researchers and community groups like this. So it's something that's very important to us to understand what role we can play in supporting and working with this form of policy engagement. So Scottish Policy and Research Exchange is a small charity. We're just the two of us. We used to be part of the Academy of Social Sciences, and variously over the years there's been 1, 2, or 3 people working for the SPRE. I joined back in 2021, one of those pandemic years that you will forget. And we then went through a change to become an independent charity, established a new model of leadership. So we shifted to a co-directorship. We also, with this change in becoming a charity, set, I guess, clear intentions and values around what we wanted to become. And a key part of that was to sort of trouble this often quite tight binary and exclusive space of academic research and policy making, to explicitly include different forms of knowledge, and reflect on the importance of looking at that through an equity lens as well. So whose knowledge is systematically excluded, whose knowledge matters more for different problems, who's experiencing those problems. So a big part of that for us is not only including practitioner knowledge, but different forms of community knowledge. So this is, yeah, as I said, quite an important space for us to learn and grow into. And one thing that we wanted to do was show up to this session more as co-learners, rather than assuming that we know what your situation is, we know what your needs are, and that we have expertise that we're just going to impart on you. So we're going to take this session a little bit differently to what we normally do. We normally sort of present some key insights from the literature, key insights about the context. Instead, this time we're going to tell a couple of personal stories from our own backgrounds and just sort of surface what we feel are some lessons, but very much open those up to discussion. I guess just a small bit about me. I am a climate scientist by training, but in the sort of deep geological past, looking at past climate change. I've then worked through various roles in policy, as you'll see in my story, in supporting large international development programs, where my experience in that kind of community engaged aspect is supporting researchers, participatory researchers who are looking to co-produce with communities in different countries as part of quite a large impact focused research program. And then I've worked in various other sort of researchy or knowledge exchange roles. Yeah, rambling slightly. I guess just a tiny bit more about Spree as well. A lot of what we do is training, but we also work on various projects. We build relationships up and build networks with policy communities and research communities and knowledge mobilization communities as well. Sia, I'll pass over to you to introduce yourself and say a bit more about the session.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, it's really lovely to be here. So in some ways, this feels like a bit of a return home for me, to be in amongst community groups and activists and organizers and things. So you'll see that from the story I share. So I'm really excited to also learn from you and hear where you're coming from. So this session is going to be interactive at a couple of key points. So Dave and I are going to tell two stories, but then we've also designed it to do some activities together, which we'll participate in. And the first one of those is a Mentimeter, which is just a really simple way for us to get a sense of who's in the room and the expertise and knowledge that you're bringing. And so a way for us to get to know each other. And if you don't know everybody in the room, for you to get a sense of where everyone else is coming from. Then we'll kick off with Dave's story. And then we're going to do an activity called power mapping, which is from a really great resource. And we're just going to take one of the activities from that resource, but we'll share the full resource with you. But it's an opportunity to do a little bit of thinking about how problems are framed and who gets involved in framing those problems, and how we go about solving them together. So it's really dynamic and hopefully will be really useful to you. And then I'll tell a story from my own experience of working in a community context. We'll do another activity, which is a strengths activity. And that will be a way of kind of building on all of the strengths that are in your context and with you personally. And then there'll be some time at the end for more of a kind of bigger discussion, not necessarily Q&A, but people might have specific questions, but it might be that there's questions that people have of each other. So I think see this as a collective of all of us in the room kind of working together for the next couple of hours. So with that in mind, it'd be great to get a sense of who's here. Great. So interesting, lots of boundary spanners, and it might be a term that you've used before, it might be a new term for you. It's a term that I use a lot, Dave does too, because we cross many different worlds. So, and then nice to see these other kind of roles, and you'll probably have other roles beyond this one, these ones that we've identified. But yeah, great to see that. And then, yeah, like a good amount of experience actually in the room in terms of engaging policymakers or other community members and researchers. And then, oh yeah, you can see where folks are based. So nice distribution in some ways, that we're not a big group, but actually we're grouped around the country. And then this is lovely, isn't it, to see why people want to engage with policymakers. Social justice, equitable systems. And yeah, this is one of the ones Dave and I were really curious about, is the engagement methods that people have used. So there's a lot of meetings and workshops of different kinds. And then, yeah, a little bit less in those kind of formal policy briefs or formal kind of communications. But the top ones, which is actually normally the way it shakes out, I think, for a lot of people. And then, oh, we haven't got that results for this one yet. So, but maybe we'll come back to that later. Saying about their impact. Oh, and yeah. So I'll stop sharing there. I think my invitation is just at this stage, it's just good for us, I think, to get a sense of particularly the kind of roles that you're taking up and the level of experience that you feel you hold in those roles. So if there's anything else you want to say by way of introduction to yourself, if you want to put that in the chat, I'm aware people might not know each other. So I'll just say briefly something about myself while you're doing that. But just to say, yeah, I have a background in, I was a young carer and continue to be a carer. So that's been a big feature of my life. And I have training in an academic context, but have mostly worked in third sector organizations or public sector organizations. So I have a research training, but actually I think of myself more in those like in between spaces, because I come from a care background, and then yeah, I feel really aligned to care work and working with third sector organizations, but do have that academic training and bring that out when I need to. So please do put any other introductions in the chat, and then we will be doing more dynamic kind of activities together in breakout rooms, so we'll get to know each other a little bit better there. But Dave, shall I hand over to you for the first story?
So yeah, one of my roles, my past roles, as I was still figuring out my career path, which I feel like only makes sense now, my current role, looking back, the sort of jumping between various research policy and research management or knowledge exchange type roles. This was a role I was in almost 10 years ago now, which is crazy to say, for the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. And I thought I'd share this story as an example of just sort of appreciating the messiness and the complexity and the dynamics of what a policy context might look like that has that sort of role of community engagement as well. And this was at a time when across the UK, and the Scottish Government in particular, we're looking at unconventional oil and gas sources and whether or not they should be exploited, whether they were safe, what their policy position should be on it. So SEPA's logo has changed now, but I'm using this one because this is what I'm familiar with, and it's from that time. So just sort of position SEPA in this policy landscape. Typically, we think about policy as, or policymakers as, one of these three key institutions of the state: Parliament, government, and the judiciary. But of course, there are many other policy intermediaries and influencers. So these are just some, and each one of these are quite big categories, which you could, we have a different slide and a different training deck where we just kind of throw all the different logos and names of different types of organizations just within the public body category, but that includes all of the local authorities, different NHS trusts, different care organizations. There's a lot just within this. We've got community organizations here, general citizens, research organizations. So the picture we're trying to paint here is that there is this, when we're talking about policy engagement, it's not only with formal policymakers. There's many other routes and there's many other interactions that you're always embedded in when you're doing this. And that's the sort of picture I'm going to try and paint from this public body perspective, and SEPA in particular. And SEPA is a non-departmental public body, which means that it is not, I guess, controlled by ministers, but it was set up and it's got the statutory duties, which have been set by the government and approved by Parliament. And it's primarily a sort of regulatory monitoring body to protect the environment. It's also got quite important and large roles around flood risk prevention and alert system as well, which sort of sits alongside the environmental protection aspects. And so the context at the time politically in 2015 was quite high levels of political interest, high levels of politics and kind of contention around the potential to exploit unconventional oil and gas, which includes fracking. And fracking in the media was often used as the sort of shorthand. But the specific bit I'm going to land on is around underground coal gasification, which is just another one of these unconventional sources of gas. But what happened at the beginning of 2015 is that Fergus Ewing here, Minister for the Environment, Energy, announced in Parliament that the Scottish Government are going to call a moratorium on any development or planning consents in particular for unconventional oil and gas. And this is one moment where it's a good example of needing to know which type of policy actor we're talking about and what their powers are. Because in the UK context, we obviously have devolved government and parliament in Scotland, as well as sort of UK-wide government and parliament in Westminster. And so Scottish Government had to think carefully about what controls they had access to put this moratorium in place. Planning consents, licenses to extract oil and gas and other petroleum products in the UK sits at that UK level. So even though there were licenses being handed out and being bid for in Scotland, Scotland was able to put a block on that by saying you can't actually do anything with that license unless you've got planning consent. And that planning consent piece sat in the reserved power that Scottish Government had. SEPA was a statutory consultee on that. And in order to get your planning consents, you needed to have certain environmental licenses in order to do that exploitation. So that's a kind of an interaction here between regulation, which is, I guess, the practical implementation of a legislation, which is that sort of legal framework that's been approved by Parliament. The policy at this point was this overall position that the Scottish Government had, which was, in this case, enacted by the sort of will of government, I guess. And the aim at this point was to undertake public consultation, further research into the environmental impacts and the health impacts, to a public consultation. And there was a number of things that Scottish Government wanted to establish before making a final policy decision on whether or not to allow unconventional oil and gas exploitation in Scotland. So that was kind of the broader context. My role within SEPA was as a policy officer supporting various national policy units, including the energy policy unit. So I was supporting the policy lead that was working on unconventional oil and gas. And a large part of my role was to undertake and sort of collate research around what the regulatory implications were, the policy implications were, and the scientific research that can help inform decision-making about whether or not some of these activities were controllable under existing regulation, what the environmental impacts might be, what we're concerned about, what the level and quality of that evidence is. So these are a set of diagrams that I produced, which kind of combine a lot of that work that was used for public and community engagement sessions. And this is specifically around coalbed methane and shale gas activities. So part of the work is to just document what is involved in these, what activities might be regulated, what might require a license, and what control SEPA might have over any pollution and other environmental impact. Interestingly, when you're looking at this, for me, it strikes me, particularly in hindsight now, where I was quite a technical scientist in the past, and now all of my work draws on sort of social science, arts, humanities, critical perspectives, the politics of knowledge. I'm in quite a different place now, and what really strikes me about this is the very technical framing of what sort of evidence I was looking at and what was deemed relevant and necessary to make these political decisions, these policy decisions. Did a bunch of work just trying to document and find examples of the different types of impact that these different activities might have, and then worked with policy and regulatory colleagues across SEPA and in other organizations. So local government, for example, is in charge of the planning consent. SEPA was a statutory consultee on that, and there's that very formal relationship. And so here's just a couple of different examples of regulations that SEPA provided license through. This one's around the water environment. This one's around extractive waste. And you can see that, and there's several others as well, which I haven't included. But as you can see, there's this sort of very nitty-gritty fine detail around what mechanisms are already in place to control what specific aspects. And so this was the sort of the lens that we were grappling with at the time. Also did a bunch of desk-based research and sort of pulled in some academic insights around what these potential hazards might be, specifically on underground coal gasification. And this was to feed into an independent review that was being carried out, interestingly, by an ex-chief executive of SEPA, who was then an independent academic afterwards, Campbell Gemmell, who was asked by the Scottish Government to do this review of underground coal gasification as a key piece of evidence that was going to be used to make this policy decision. So I just wanted to share a few reflections on SEPA's contribution to this report, which is one small piece of it. And this report is one small piece of this wider picture of what evidence was being used and what other influencing factors were being drawn on and decisions being made around making this policy decision. And first and foremost, I think that it's this kind of quite acute political attention, which is the thing that triggered the need for SEPA to pay a lot of attention to this and looking at it through its statutory duties. So SEPA has a legal role. Its role was very much bounded around these quite technical, regulatory, engineering and environmental impact perspectives. This was kind of inseparable from the campaigning work that was happening, and there was a lot of freedom of information requests being passed through to SEPA. There was quite a lot of hot political attention on it, a lot of articles coming out in the media, and a lot of community engagement work as well that SEPA was partly involved in to understand what those concerns were in areas where some of the extraction might have been taking place. All of this really did have a shape on what types of impacts we really had to evidence and look at. So, for example, particularly with fracking, seismicity, earthquakes was a big community concern. But if you only looked at the academic literature, then you wouldn't have seen that as a big concern because the earthquake potential was relatively small compared to other environmental impacts. So this sort of public and community and media and campaign pressure groups shaped our attention and which types of evidence we needed to engage with. And then my particular contribution was not an individual contribution. I worked a lot with people across SEPA to draw on our own policy, technical and scientific expertise. I did a bunch of desk-based research, which kind of drew from my own curiosities and background in climate science. I still had access to my old journal subscriptions from being part of Edinburgh University. I was fresh out of my PhD. And then just sort of informally engaged with academics as well as commissioning work, for example, through Climate Exchange, which is a different intermediate body. There was various forms of evidence and expertise that fed into the sort of work that we submitted to this report. And to jump to the sort of the long story short ending, the media reported, and in some ways this is very true, that because of this evidence that this expert report provided, the government were able to make a decision to ban outright this particular unconventional gas exploitation practice. I say ostensibly because I do wonder the degree to which it was only reliant on that evidence. So if the evidence was less concrete, would this decision still being made? We're talking about a very political context here, with a number of other factors to take into account, not only evidence. Obviously, the campaign groups were quite happy about this, as was I. So a few things just to take away from that brief snippet into that bit of context is that firstly, there is no single person or single organization or single role that controls the policy process. There are many different actors working in many different ways with different forms of formalized and informalized power that control different aspects of that system. So we're talking about quite a messy, complex network of institutions and actors. So perhaps one starting point is always to ask who holds power over what. So within that context, you're looking at who are the people that you should be engaging with? Is this a reserved issue, a devolved issue, a local government issue, public body issue? What are their specific remits around that? There are always many different ideas, often competing and conflicting ideas around what good evidence looks like and what relevant evidence looks like. In that SEPA context, a lot of that was heavily shaped by SEPA as a structure. So it had a formal position and remit, but also my particular role was really shaped by my own interests and by my own lens on what good evidence looks like. And if I was to do that same piece of work now, I would have quite a different angle and look at different sources for evidence. So, which forms of knowledge are being valued and why? And finally, it's this sort of political context. Any evidence use is always political. So we shouldn't assume that people making decisions in these public spaces are undertaking a logic of rational decision making. In fact, there's very good evidence to say that no one makes purely rational decisions, but instead we're in this context of sensible decision making or political decision making. So we're often, I find in the spaces that we work in at least, that there's this assumption that the way to improve policy is through more evidence. And so implicitly, the problem with good policy making is a lack of evidence. And sometimes that really is the case, but I think you'll all know very clear examples where there is no lack of evidence, there's no sort of deficit in good communication of that evidence. There are other factors at play, often very political factors around who holds power, what their vested interests are, what other factors are shaping decision making. But when you're engaging with your evidence in certain contexts, you're not only communicating evidence, you're also shaping underlying ideas, you're also legitimizing different forms of knowledge, you're building relationships, you're changing capacities. So there's a lot of other things that you can help contribute to shifting, which isn't just about providing very clear explanation of one form of evidence. So what else is happening? Is it only a lack of evidence, or are there other things at play? So that's my little story. See, I'll pass over to you. The next step.
Great. Thanks, Dave. So yeah, we're sharing stories with you as a way of helping you also to touch into your own stories and experience. And so this activity we're going to do in pairs, and Dave and I will participate as well. So it's a power mapping activity, and I'm just going to share my screen and talk us through it, and then we're going to upload the document for you. And so when we go off into breakout rooms, you should still be able to access it. There's no expectation for you to do all of this, but the intention is to think about there's different dimensions of power, as many people will know, and this booklet that we're going to share with you is really helpful for talking about power at different stages of a process. So that might be a planning of any kind of project, doesn't have to be a research project, or planning of a campaign if you're working more in an activist space. So there's something about goal power, which is the ability to kind of be involved in designing and framing the problem. So this activity helps us to think through who was involved in deciding what good looks like. What are the outcomes or the impacts that we're trying to achieve, and what is the problem? How do we understand the problem? And so it's just a way of visualizing some of that and talking us through that. So there's some instructions there. And if it's helpful, I would say just start with one of the questions that's easiest to start with, because with the time that we have, we won't be able to finish it, but it's to give us a taste of what this is. And then in the booklet, you'll see there's other types of power, and it just helps us all. I guess the intention is, if we're more transparent about some of the power dynamics that we're experiencing, we're better able to navigate them, we're better able to work with them in a productive way. So I will stop sharing, and I will also now upload this.
Yeah, hopefully you all had nice discussions. I had a nice chat with Lauren. It's actually a framework that I've not used myself before, but it's the sort of questions that I've engaged a lot before. So I find it particularly satisfying to seeing something so structured. What we're going to do now for the next 10 minutes is just have a bit of sharing about what is it that came up, groups. So if we want to go around just each group and one person share a few thoughts. Yeah, and nice to hear your final reflections on top there. I guess I'm left with a sense of there's so much knowledge and wisdom here around the complexities of what shapes who's able to be involved in goal setting, in defining the problem. One maybe final reflection, and then we'll move on to Catherine Rose's story, is that we've not talked too much in these examples of when we're engaging with policy processes, who gets to shape the agenda there, who gets to define the goals. I think from my experience, at least, there can be a lot of the downside to that. Lauren gave a nice example of where there is more deliberate moves for that kind of co-agenda setting, but often that's left hidden and implicit. And I think that's where a lot of the power and politics are maintained, is if we're not looking at that when we're opening it up. So I guess just my reflection, my own practice is just always being curious about how that agenda is set, how the ideas underpinning what you're trying to do is set. And that might be an important angle that you're trying to influence or change simply by enabling others to show up to the table, or to reframe your question or your evidence, making the difference or the alternatives in goals visible, rather than taking for granted that the problem is defined in this way and the goal should be that. So I think it's an important angle to consider when you're thinking about influencing policy with evidence, is just making those politics visible and deliberating how you engage with that. Ceilidh, do you want to take us through your little story of Bromley by Bow?
So I'm going to share, are you seeing the Bromley by Bow image? This is a little story about that community that I was working in. I was an embedded researcher there for 3 years. And I suppose just by way of introduction, this is a picture that we took, I think, on our first day. I co-led this work with someone called Becky Ceilidh, and we climbed up to the top floor of one of the tower blocks and took a picture of what the Bromley by Bow kind of neighborhood looks like in East London. So just to give you a bit of a sense of this community and our role there. So we were invited in. This is an image of the Bromley by Bow Centre, which is actually a community centre and a GP practice, a health centre, that both of them were formed probably 35 years ago now. And they secured funding essentially that they then wanted people to come in and do an embedded research project with them. So in the sense of, and there's something for us to talk about, I think, around when we talk about things being community-led. It was community-led, this work, because it was led by the organizations. But of course, there is always something when we're talking about community, about when we're talking about the chief exec of a community organization or the director of a GP practice, even though they're rooted in the community and those are community organizations, there's some layers and distinctions, isn't there, around community members within that geographical area, or who have associations with that space in whatever way. So there's something for me around, yes, this was in lots of ways a community-led project, but I suppose we got under the skin a little bit more about what that meant. So this is a photo of the Eid celebrations, and I like to show this photo because it has the mayor of Tower Hamlets. Tower Hamlets has a mayor, the local authority. It's got one of the mums who was a single mum at the time and is one of the founders of Bromley by Bow, and then the chief executive, and they're playing a game. You can see them by the sculpture there. And then this is a list of some of the different kinds of activities that this collective of a GP practice and a community org run for that community. So lots of it is kind of formal support, but there's also a group of artists who are based in Bromley by Bow and are part of the founding members. And so that sculpture in the middle is made by one of the artists who helped to found the centre 35 years ago. So quite an interesting place. Our role in particular was to focus on how the Bromley by Bow Centre and the model of the Bromley by Bow kind of community centre and GP practice together were reducing health inequalities. So there was a really strong focus about telling that story of what they were doing to improve health in the community, to create health, and also reduce some of the inequalities that affect that part of East London, which has for many years now, 4 decades, had really, really high levels of inequality. And what's interesting about these 3 kind of words of evidence, methodology, mobilization, is that actually there's a lot of evidence out there already about health inequalities and its impact. And the issue isn't that we need more evidence to describe the problem. We actually need evidence of the solutions, of some of the interventions. So that's where Bromley by Bow comes in, that it is an intervention into these big structural inequalities that affect us as communities. But there's also a real call to make the method of producing evidence more equitable and more diverse. So lots of evidence gets produced in universities, which we know, and the idea here is that we maybe need to diversify who's involved in producing that evidence. And so that's one of the things we set out to do. And then really importantly, that evidence doesn't sit in a report or on a shelf, but can be used actively beyond the life cycle of that particular research project. And so that is also something that we set out to do. So I'll share a few insights, just kind of 3 lessons learned that I thought might be helpful for us to have a conversation about. And I think many of them are things that people are already surfacing in our discussion. So this may be more of a validation of things that you're already doing. But one of the elements of this for us is about working with the system you're in. So understanding that landscape, and then also working to expand the boundaries of what's possible within the system. So doing both of those things simultaneously. And I'll share an example of that. And then knowing that power will be present in the context, which we've just talked about, and people have got really sophisticated understandings of that. So I'll share some examples of how we used reflective practice as a tool to help us make sure that we were aligned with our purpose and values and didn't get pulled in unhelpfully to power dynamics. And then for us, it was really important to work in ways that were meaningful to collaborators, so that the values that we were, kind of anchoring ourselves in, or the practices we were using, or the resources we were making together could all be used beyond the time that we were there. So we came into that community and were based there for 3 years, but I'm not from that community, and I knew I wouldn't continue to live in that community. And so there was something about honoring the work that was already there, and just augmenting it and further resourcing it, rather than trying to do something that would be all bells and whistles and then we would leave and take it away with us. So the first point about working with the existing system, as we've just talked about in terms of hierarchies, of course, this just paints one picture of an organization, but it is really common for organizations to have organograms, and they do tell a story, don't they, of one way of understanding that organization. So we circled in orange some of the spaces that we were working in really closely in terms of working collaboratively with these teams. But I guess the picture for me paints, just even, I don't know how conscious some of this is when people build organograms, but, the chief executive's name is bigger, isn't it, in terms of font? He's a lovely person, very community oriented. His kids were actually born in the building that I showed you in terms of that picture. So he's certainly of the community in lots of ways, but in terms of the ways that we think of organizations as hierarchical institutions, there is something about these levels and layers, and we needed to work all up and down the organization. But you can also see sort of in the middle here, that's us in this team. So we're actually listed there as part of the organization. So we were working with the system. And some of that involved producing things that were meaningful to the system, like an evaluation framework. And that's something that they needed to be able to secure future funding. So producing an outcomes framework, working with the kind of tools and language that were meaningful to those organizational structures was really important in terms of, you know, those practitioners and leaders are also of that community. So there's something about doing work that is meaningful for them, and helping them to make sure that they secure the resources that they need to keep doing their work. But we also tried to work in a more flat way, work in a more collaborative way. So this is some of the images of the ways that we worked, doing community participatory work. And so this is a picture of the community research team. And here's another photo of them. So we recruited a collection of community researchers to work with us through the project. And that had a flat structure in terms of the way that that team operated. So they made decisions together. They used democratic decision-making processes, and the decisions that they took about the research that they focused on was all co-led by them. And we know Paulo Freire, but it's just to say that for us, there was something about building trust. And I think one of the earlier training sessions that Lauren shared with us was there was this real focus on how do we build trust as a kind of core element of the way that we're working. So the horizontal relationships, certainly there's something about that structure of horizontal relationships are, you know, designed in a way to help you work on that question of trust together. But trust was really important for us, of course, also working hierarchically. So producing that outcomes framework, for example, was a way of us building trust with that existing system and knowing what they needed to survive in a really high pressured funding context. So one of the metaphors that we have is of bees doing this waggle dance. I'm going to show another image after this, but it's about how, you know, working in hierarchy has its own kind of logic. Working in community and working in a kind of flat system also has its own logic. And so Becky and I, as the co-leads, sat in this space between trying to do a dance with both of these. And actually, it was a really fertile space of possibility for us. And so this is some of the images of us working on the left with the practitioners in that space. And then on the right, that's me kind of out on the street with one of the founding members of Bromley by Bow, kind of doing more work that was just in the neighborhood. And this is a really lovely image again of this waggle dance, which is about thinking about that external kind of public agencies, hierarchical systems, and then the kind of more system of relationships that is horizontal in a community context. And that space of possibility, I guess, is the message I wanted to land with you, that sometimes we think it can be really just very challenging for us to work with those two different logics, but it can actually be a really creative space as well, because you get to see how those two ways of working function, and you get to translate yourself in between those. So that's something I think for us that was really valuable. But there was, of course, loads of power dynamics in that, and it could be confusing for us when we would go into a community, you know, into our community research team working horizontally, and then next thing we know, we've got 10 minutes with the chief executive. We've got to land, 3 key messages about what's happening from this research project, right? And you're just tracking back and forth between cups of tea, really open-ended time, things being about good conversation, having, say, 3-4 hours with people to work creatively, and then having these really short and sharp kind of presentation type meetings to the senior leaders in the organization that maybe were in the diary for months at a time. And so for us, navigating these two worlds and the power dynamics within them required us to have a very deliberate practice of doing reflection. So this is just an image of the journal. This is Becky's, and we would take 2 hours, I think, every Friday morning, sometimes 3, particularly because we were embedded. And so for us, it was really important to make sure that we got good time to get a little bit of distance from our work. And so this was just absolutely non-negotiable. So no matter what else we were doing that week, whatever the other pressures were, we did just commit to having those 2 hours of reflective practice every week. And this is a picture from my journal. And so one of the things I started to do was to plot my kind of peaks and troughs in the week, like where the energy was, where things were going well. And I started to do these little dials, of where I was putting my energy in terms of where I was spending my time. But the idea of reflective practice is that it drives you also towards action. So we would do our reflective practice on a Friday, and then we would start to identify what the priorities were for the coming week or the weeks to come, so that we would sort of be intentional then about what the work was that was facing us. So we would move from a really reactive space into a more responsive space. And then just finally, just that idea of working in ways that matter to our collaborators. So for us, we had funding from Public Health England. Public Health England at the time, it's now changed kind of configuration, but one of the things they wanted was for us to produce a training resource. So we did that because that was meaningful to other practitioners in this space about how to do good community participatory led research. So that's one of the things we produced. We worked with Duncan Selby, who was the chief exec at the time, to get a lovely quote. And so one of the ways that those practitioners at Public Health England would use that resource is if it was signaled by their senior leaders as valuable. So that was one of the things that we made sure that we did. And we were very grateful to him for trumpeting the work as a good example. But, for people in this room and for us, it was most important that this was trusted by the community itself. And so this is our big celebration event. We did an exhibition. That's the chief exec reading some notes, and the director of the GP practice is next to him. And in the blue suit is the head of the Royal College of Physicians. So quite senior leaders, but actually then we've got various people in the room who are founders of Bromley by Bow. And I've got another photo of them actually in the next slide, of some of the folks who are kind of working with the stories that we created. So we produced, tangible stories that people could read, which was a reflection back of their own experience. And that for us, just to kind of conclude, is what's kept us in relationship with Bromley by Bow. So we finished our work in 2019, but I did some voluntary work for them through COVID. Becky, who I co-led the work with, has produced this lovely podcast, Communities in the Making. And so that all ran after the work was finished. And then I kind of I hosted a radical health event for them as well. I think that's probably 18 months ago now. So there's things, I guess, about good relationships breed, build more contact and more connection. And then all of that work has continued on. So Becky was actually in there 2 weeks ago doing some more work with that community. So there's something about, that long game of how change happens over time, not just within the project confines that we might have, and how we can think of that long trajectory. So that's the story. I'll stop sharing now. Hopefully that was, I think, validating maybe of some of the experiences that people have been already sharing. And I think we're going to go into another activity, aren't we, Dave?
I always love hearing your story about that, and some really nice messages that came out as well. So we're going to do a strengths activity now. So we're going to put you into breakout rooms again of 2 or 3, I guess, depending on how that works out with the numbers we have now. And the invitation is just to, look at these categories. We've put these categories of different strengths to think about where you're starting from in your context, and what it is that you're bringing to that, and what opportunities are in your context, to try and find that sort of fit between where you're at, what your strengths are, and what the opportunities are to do this sort of policy engagement work that's also wrapped around all the other types of engagement work that you do. We won't have time to look through all of them. We'll only have a little bit of time at the end just to do a very quick reflection back. And we might even not have that. I'll double check with UCR on that. So just to talk through them briefly, the personal and professional strengths, that's very much about you. What do you think you're good at? It might be, really enjoy making graphic art, or, talking and connecting with people, or facilitating, or writing clearly about complex evidence-based problems. Thinking about the strengths of your community and collaborators. So what is it within this community that you're part of, the different organizations you're part of? how are they positioned in this space? What relationships might they have? What credibility? There's lots of other dimensions to that you might want to pull out and think about. The strengths of your context. So this might be more around the sort of windows of opportunity that you see, if there's political legitimacy around the issues that you're looking at, if there's already some processes in place that you can connect into. And then strengths of your study area. So the types of research that you're trying to do. If it's very quantitative, that might bring its own strengths around what decision makers like to see. If it's very qualitative, there's often we hear from policymakers the impact of having a compelling story. And is that something that your particular research might be able to draw on and provide? We've heard examples in other situations where their particular study area involves interviewing a lot of policymakers. And so you can really get an understanding of their context and the values that they're bringing into what evidence they use. So hopefully that makes sense. Please do put in the chat or take off your microphone if you've got any questions about that. But thanks for popping that in the chat there, CR. Lauren, would you be able to put us into breakout groups of at least 2 people? Well, thanks everyone. Hopefully that was enough time to get into a bit of a discussion around it. So before we kind of share anything about that, what we'll do now is you can share some of that perhaps on a few quick Mentimeter slides. I'll just pop the link. I can also put the link in the chat if you want to click straight on it. But if you just go through to part 2, final reflections and feedback, and we have a question there around strengths. So that can be where you share some of your thoughts there.
Okay, great. So keen to finish on time. So what we sometimes do at the end of these things is just to get everyone to think of a word that might be, a word that helps anchor you and what you want to take away from this session. So try to think of one word that helps you to think about what was meaningful for you from this time. And then we'll each of us share the word, and we have time for you to say one sentence. So like not a paragraph or like things with loads of commas in it, but just one sentence about why you chose that word.
Thank you both to CR and Dave. I knew this was going to be an incredibly valuable and rich session, but I got even more out of it than I was anticipating. So thanks so much. Thanks for watching the recording. This training was originally delivered as part of a bespoke capacity building program in 2024 for the Highlands and Islands Climate Change Community Grants Programme. This was delivered by Science Ceilidh and the British Science Association and funded by UK Research and Innovation. Special thanks to our training providers for delivering the session. And then this video and the accompanying resources were edited by Science Ceilidh and Paul Maguire Film. Keep watching to see some additional resources for other areas of support and some other details about the training session. Find out more about our learning around funding communities to lead on climate change action research and see additional resources, including accompanying worksheets to this video through the Community Knowledge Matters website. To find out more, go to communityknowledgematters.com/climate action.